For that. That was wonderful. Yes, wasn't it great? Well, good morning. It's good to see you all. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to express my appreciation to Reverend Aaron for the invitation to speak, and my appreciation for each of you for being such a welcoming family, and Mary Ann being such a great host. I love speaking at this ministry, and I'm grateful to be here once again today. And today is October 21st, right? And you know what that means, right? Only 2 more months before the end of the world. How can we forget? So, you better take that trip you've been planning before it's too late. But don't spend all of your money because we might survive another end of the world. As you probably know, the Mayan calendar ends at this particular date, and a lot of people have interpreted that in various ways. Everything from it's the end of the world to they ran out of rock or the chisel broke or something that happened. And I believe it probably does mark the end of a cycle in some way, but I really don't think the world is going to end. But I do think it is the end of a world. And what I mean by that, it takes a little explanation. If we look at the history of evolution of life on this planet, about 50,000 years ago, we turned a very important corner. About 50 to 100,000 years ago, the leading edge of evolution ceased to be biological evolution and became the evolution of consciousness. So when we talk about evolution today, when I talk about evolution today, I'm talking about the evolution of consciousness because that's what's pushing the envelope. It's not the physical form. It's the mental form. For example, if we look back 50,000 years, the human body has changed very little, if any at all. Our bodies today are very much the same as they were back then. But if you look at our consciousness today, if you look at the world today, things have changed a little bit in the last 50,000 years. Would you not agree with me? And in that 50,000 year period, humankind has evolved through several levels of consciousness. When we first woke up from our animal-like existence, we operated primarily through instinct. And then over many millions and thousands of years, we began to operate more through magic and superstition. And then we begin to evolve and work through mythology and faith and religion. And then the age of reason came along, and we began to evolve into reason and thought. And now what's next? We're ready for the next step, the step into intuition, from instinct to intellect to intuition. So let's just take a look at where we're at right now. Our current worldview, the way you and I see reality, the way we see time and space, the things that we think are important, what we call the real world, is really only about 400 years old. This came into being just about 4 centuries ago. Our modern worldview is very, very different than the worldview of, say, 1600. In the medieval perspective, which existed for over 1,000 years, and which in many ways we've just barely come out of, in that particular perspective, the world looked very, very different than it does to us. That world was very fixed and static. Human beings were at the center of the universe, and everything was fixed and determined. There was a hierarchy, At the top was God, as defined by the Catholic Church. Next came the king. The king was simply God on earth. Next became men, then women and children, then the rest of creation. And that hierarchy was preordained, and it was the way things were. And it reflected the hierarchy of the heavens. And any time we messed with this hierarchy down on earth, we were messing with that same hierarchy up in heaven. God forbid anybody try to change anything. In the year 1600, Robert Brumet, who was a Dominican scholar, and not a scientist, there were no scientists then, but he was a philosopher and a forward-thinking person. At that time, he proposed that the sun was not the center of the universe, that it was but a star, that the earth revolved around the sun, and that the universe contained an infinite number of other suns and stars and planets, and other intelligent beings inhabited them. This was in the year 1600. Now, for that, he should have gotten the Nobel Prize, don't you think? Instead, he was burned at the stake. It's called having a good idea, but not at the right time. And yet, within 100 years, along came Newton, Descartes, Galileo, Copernicus, a whole host of individuals that laid the foundation for modern science, for our worldview today, the age of reason, laid the worldview for democracy, which came along a little bit later, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. In that 100-year period, the world changed radically. The world that we live in is the result of that change that took place back then. And we owe what we call reality to the vision and to the courage of a relatively few number of individuals. Well, many people believe that today we are living at such a time. We are living at a time when we are, perhaps by necessity, needing to evolve to a new way of being. This has been written about by many, many philosophers and scientists, Teilhard de Chardin, Jean Gebser, to name a few, and there's many, many others. Many of you are familiar with Barbara Marx Hubbard and her work. So there's a long list of individuals that can point to evidence and can point to reasons why this is emerging. And I think I can give the best reason of all, and that is that we have to, that we need to do it in order to survive. Because we find ourselves, we as human beings, find ourselves at a crucial juncture in our history. We have gotten to the point where we have developed science, technology, reason beyond anything we could have dreamed of even a decade ago, 50 years ago. Our development, however, has become dangerously one-sided. We have achieved an astounding degree of knowledge of the material world, but we are appallingly ignorant of ourselves. We have put all of our energy into understanding the universe, to understanding nature, and not nearly enough energy into understanding ourselves. If we look at the mainstream science today, it's still believed that consciousness is simply a byproduct of protein molecules and neurons firing in the brain, you see. We have a deluge of information. The content of information in our world today is doubling about every year and a half. The knowledge that we're gaining is literally exploding. And yet, if that is not met with a corresponding internal explosion in wisdom and in love, then we're going to be in deep trouble. And many say we're already in deep trouble. Many think it's too late already. I do not, but I do think it's very urgent. Today, the greatest threat to human existence is humanity itself. Some years back, one of the British newspapers printed a question to the public. It says, "What's wrong with our world?" And a particular philosopher and author, G.K. Chesterton, wrote a brief letter to the editor and said, "Dear sirs, I am. Sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." Most of us are not that honest. Most of us do not recognize that what we take for granted and what we think is real may be limiting us. And maybe the universe is calling us to go beyond who we are. Maybe the universe is calling us to go beyond any concept of who we think we are. Maybe the universe is calling us to go beyond anything we've ever done before. It's time for us to see with a new set of eyes, to see in a whole new way. Because the physical universe is the same now as it was 400 years ago. But the world that we live in is very different than it was 400 years ago. And so we need to create a new reality. We need to create a new world. Physically, it may be the same world, who knows? But as our eyes change, reality changes. And as reality changes, everything else changes. Waking up has become an evolutionary necessity. Evolution is natural. It's trying to happen. We don't have to make it happen. But what we do need to do is to look at how we are getting in the way of that evolution. What's holding us back? And what's holding us back is that we have become identified with a particular way of being. We have become identified with a particular way of defining ourselves. We have become identified with the mind. The mind has become a wonderful tool, but it's a terrible master. And we need to go beyond the mind, which doesn't mean giving it up, but recognizing that we are much more, and that to function in the new world, we have to function at a whole new way of being. Back in the 1960s, a rare and beautiful white tiger named Mohini was given to the Washington, D.C. Zoo as a gift. And back in those days, animals were kept in cages. And Mohini was put in a cage, a 10 by 10 foot cage. And being a big, beautiful tiger with lots of energy, she had to move around, and so she did. She paced a figure 8 inside that cage all day long. 8, 10, 12 hours a day, she would pace back and forth in that figure 8. And after a few decades, the zoo decided to expand her space, as was the movement back in the late 70s and the 80s, was to create more of a natural habitat for Mohini. So they created several acre compound for Mohini to run and play, and had trees and rocks and a cave in it, and a little pond and all of the natural surroundings for her. So the day came when they released Mohini into her new space, and with excitement looked forward to her enjoying her newfound freedom. But instead, Mohini immediately ran into the far corner of the compound and began pacing in a figure 8, 10 by 10, the same figure 8 that she had been tracking for over a decade before. That became her survival strategy. And she did it for so long, it probably rewired the neurons in her brain, and she knew nothing else. And that poor animal continued to pace until the day she died, many, many years later. The grass was worn bare in her spot, and the rest of the compound was untouched. Now, what's so sad is that we see that Mohini's bars were not external, but internal. Even though she had the opportunity to be more than what she was not able to do so. And we have done the same thing. We have looked at what has worked so well, the world of the mind, the world of thinking, the world of technology, the world of doing. And so we keep pacing back and forth in our figure eights. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. But we need to look around and realize the world is bigger. And the world is calling us to go beyond who we were before. It's frightening to let go of our comfort zone. Marianne Williamson has written, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that frightens us the most." One of the greatest fears we have is the fear of freedom, because we define ourselves by our limitations. And to let go of those limitations can be kind of scary. But we are being called to go beyond. We are being called by love. We are being called by life to go beyond who we are and beyond anything that we have been. I want to read to you an excerpt from a book by Nikos Kazantzakis. Nikos Kazantzakis, as you may remember, was the author of Zorba, the Greek. Wonderful story. And he writes with the passion of Zorba in this particular passage, and I quote, "Blowing through heaven and earth and in our hearts and in the heart of every living thing is a gigantic breath, a great cry, which we call God. Plant life wished to continue its motionless sleep next to stagnant waters, but the cry leaped up within it and violently shook its roots. Away, let go of the earth, walk. Had the tree been able to think and to judge, it would have cried, I don't want to. What you are urging me to do is impossible. But the cry, without pity, kept shaking its roots and shouting, away, let go of the earth, walk. It shouted in this way for thousands of aeons, and lo, as a result of desire and struggle, life escaped the motionless tree and was liberated. Then animals appeared, first worms, making their home in water and mud. We're just fine here, they said. We have peace and security. We're not going anywhere. But the terrible cry hammered itself into their loins. Leave the mud, stand up, give birth to your betters. We don't want to. We can't. You can't. But I can. Stand up. And lo, after thousands of aeons, man emerged, trembling on his still unsolid legs. The human being is a centaur. His equine hoofs are planted in the ground, but his body, from breast to head, is worked on and tormented by the merciless cry. He has been fighting again for thousands of aeons to draw himself like a sword out of his animalistic scabbard. And now, he is also fighting to draw himself out of his human scabbard. Man calls in despair, where can I go? I have reached the pinnacle. Beyond is the abyss. And the cry answers, I am beyond. Stand up. And so we as human beings live with an interesting paradox. We have this cry within us, within our heart, calling us to be more than we ever have been. And at the same time, we have this drive to hold on to the familiar, to the safe. And so we pray, God, please change me at depth, but not too much and not too soon. Okay? But that's not the way evolution works, you see. It throws us up on the beach, gasping for air. We think we're going to die, but we don't. We don't. Because it's not us that's doing it. It's the cry. It's the life that's doing it through us. And what's important to remember is this is happening for each one of us in a different way. In your life and in my life, you are being called to stand up in some way. You are being called to breathe air for the first time. You are being called to sprout wings for the first time. You are being called to live in a whole new way. And your way can only be done by you. It cannot be done by me or by anyone else. So it's important to go within, listen to your heart, to feel the cry, to feel the call, and to know that that call, that cry is over 13 billion years old. It's coming from way, way back. In fact, I'd like to try a little experiment. If you could put your hand on your heart, feel your heartbeat, or maybe your neck if that works better for you. Just feel your heartbeat. How long has that heart been beating? 40, 50, 60 years? Maybe. I would venture to say that heart's been beating for over 13 billion years. That heartbeat began with the Big Bang. The scientists cannot explain where the Big Bang came from, and they cannot explain what beats your heart. They can tell you how, but they can't tell you why, what's behind it. And I believe that what's behind each heartbeat is the same force that exploded into the Big Bang, creating time and space. And with every heartbeat, we are reborn. And with every heartbeat, we have the opportunity to become more than we've ever been, each in our own way. And I think we not only can, but we have to. And so I bless you in your journey of awakening. God bless.